like a librarian, and so on. And so I took the name Abdul Hakimu, which stands for the servant of knowledge. So my full name is Servant of Knowledge, the Son of Word. And I kind of dig that. And but I did it intentionally, not to distance myself from my family. And so I wrote a letter to my family explaining the whole change. But of course, to my older relatives, I was always little Jerry. So, that's just the way that is. Now, with regard
Yeah.
to your second question about, now remind me what that was? Truth.
Yeah, and
Black
we can
studies.
get
Yeah,
further, maybe have further questions to help clarify that
yeah.
one as we go. But just in general, Black studies Black studies needing more than an interesting appeal to
Yeah.
truth in some abstract universal sense.
One of
Um,
the let me just say one of the interesting things about higher education in the United States, as opposed to Europe, Germany, for example, is that it always has historically made a break with the idea that higher education was about theology. And a lot of the older institutions were really based on the ideological orientation of religion, and as a way to sort of anchor the society. And so the development of a practical aspect of education was very important. More specifically, at the University of Illinois, for example, it's a land grant institution. The land grant institutions were set up in every state in order to improve agriculture and industry. And so what we have also in the development of professional institutions like law schools, business colleges, as well as agricultural colleges, et cetera. So when we start talking about Black studies, it wasn't just an activity that represented some abstract acquisition of knowledge. It was knowledge in pursuit of transforming the community, the society, much like land grant institutions and generally what people understand higher education to be about in a practical sense. And so, because otherwise, our study would be the study of a problem without having any connection to a solution. And so, what we're talking about is the relationship between academic work, for example, and public policy. In other words, to inform public policy in search of the transformation of society that will enable all of us to live a meaningful life.
yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to delve a bit deeper into knowledge for the sake of social transformation. My second question, I believe this comes from the Shoals Journal, and you were talking with Sundiata Akoli, and he writes, at its inception, Black studies represented an oppositional project, and as such, it had a dual purpose. One, to recover subjugated knowledge, that is, to reconstruct research and instructions on the Black experience, and two, to rewrite the historic relationship between the campus and the Black community. It is this legacy, the insurgent tradition of the committed intellectual who not only produces engaged scholarship, but also is actively engaged in the Black freedom movement, that Black studies scholars must revive. Can you speak to what does this mean for us today, and how or why is knowledge subjugated, Black knowledge subjugated, any kind of knowledge, but especially Black knowledge? And what do you mean? What do you mean when you say reconstruct research instructions? And how can this revival happen?
Well, I think there is a very interesting field of study called the sociology of knowledge that is locating knowledge within society. And that enterprise really leads one to class and leads one to power. And so what we have is the organization of society around power levels, and the people with the most power control those aspects of society, those agencies that produce or contain or represent memory of knowledge. So publishing houses, universities for that matter, with the university trustees, et cetera, and so on. That's the structure that historically has existed. And that is also connected to what is often called a canon. That is to say, a reference to a body of artifacts, books, what have you, paintings, et cetera, that should be remembered as sort of representing the essence of a society. And so therefore, for example, in Europe and in the European diaspora, you get the Eurocentric foundation of knowledge. So the reference is always to the works of Greece and Rome as sort of foundational to knowledge and to logic and to what we should all know in order to lead a good life and have a solid society. Well, as it turns out, there's more to the world, there's more to our species than Greece and Rome. So the reconstruction of knowledge assumes that there is this structure that we inherit from the ruling elites historically over time. And so the democratic reconstruction of knowledge means first and foremost the diversification across the world. So what about China? What about India? What about Africa? What about the Zulu, et cetera? And then also, that's just the diversity at one level, but there's another diversity, and that diversity is from the bottom up in society. So that, for example, we often think of history being the history of elites. Maybe you ask somebody about American history, and they might tell you about certain presidents or those kind of references. And in fact, there is this whole new way of looking at history called social history, where history is really about, frankly, all the rest of us. What is everyday life like? What were most people like? And this is, of course, a way of saying, wait a minute now, the symphony is important music, but what the hillbillies were doing, what the blues singers were doing, might have more to say about American people, American society, than the inheritance from Europe. So it seems to me that this whole idea of reconstruction has to do with, first, diversification across ethnicities around the world, and secondly, a class orientation to reconstruct knowledge from the point of view of the majority of us. And if you take, for example, the way in which the value orientation of the society is, the masses of people are supposed to not be too intelligent. That's the way it's set up. Obviously, if we have a whole section of society that's not informed, then democracy is impossible. So, we have to talk about, and see, this is a problem, not just in the sense of who's doing the wrong, it's who the wrong is being done to. Is caught up in we're not supposed to know. Why ask me? Ask somebody else. Ask a lawyer. And the reality is, it's sort of like being in going to a doctor. You're not supposed to know about your own health. But if you don't know about your own health, you're in trouble. If what you're going to listen to is anybody that happens to be a nurse or a doctor or whatever, they may not even be interested in you. And the results of research indicate that when Black people go to see a medical official, they don't get the same treatment as other people. So, and I'm sure that's true with poor people in general. They don't want to even hear what you have to say. Here, take this pill. And so anyway, my whole point is that, but I could go further. I mean, what about the reconstruction based on gender? What about the reconstruction based on region of the country? You come from a small town in Mississippi, you ain't definitely not supposed to know anything. So, we've got really this whole idea that we have to deal with Langston Hughes's poem when he said, "Let America be America again, the land it never has been yet and yet must be, the land where everyone is free." See, this is a we're in search of something that has never been. And the reconstruction of knowledge is an essential foundation step toward what we're talking about. See, Black studies is needed by Black people first and foremost, but the truth of the matter is Black studies is needed by everybody. You know, somebody said they've taken our blues and gone. I want them to get the blues. You know, the more you understand the blues, the more you can be a human being that might be cool enough to have a relationship with, you know.
Yeah, that resonates so much with me, and I'm thinking about when you talk about gender as well. I'm thinking about Alexis Pauline Gumbs and how she's called herself a Black feminist love evangelist. And she's like, I wish everybody was a Black feminist, right? And so that these kinds of ethics would be the things that can lead us into transformed worlds and
Mm,
transformed relations,
mm,
transformed imaginations.
mm,
But you're talking about the importance of diversifying where knowledge is produced from within ethnic groups and a class orientation to reconstruct so that is from the bottom up rather than from the top down. I'm thinking about breaks that have historically been made, and I'm thinking about one, John Henry Clark. In the history of Black studies, you write, quote, as early as 1969, militant Black studies activists broke away from the mainstream African Studies Association
yeah.
uh, to create an organization that reflected the ideological agency to build unity across the African diaspora. John Henry Clark, one of the leaders of this movement, stated the mission of the new organization, the African Heritage Studies Association. Quote, the intent of the African Heritage Studies Association is to use African history to effect a world union of African people. The Association of Scholars of African Descent is committed to the preservation, interpretation, and creative preservation of the historical and cultural heritage of African people, both on the ancestral soil of Africa and in diaspora in the Americas and throughout the world. We interpret African history from a Pan-Africanist perspective that defines all Black people as an African people. Can you speak to the importance in this reconstructing of knowledge? Can you speak to the importance, one, of John Henry Clark? What I've heard from Greg Carr is James Turner and John Henry Clark are kind of responsible for the naming of Black studies as Black studies and Africana studies. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the name that this tradition has, and then also the place of Pan-Africanism in reconstructing our identities. And yeah. Can you speak to those?
Yeah. Uh, well, first of all, at the heart, really, of the racist um, demeaning of knowledge regarding the Black experience uh, was to separate Black people from Africa and from the African diaspora. And so this has been an important issue. In fact, before the 1960s, a large part of the Black community was really disconnected from Africa, even shameful about Africa. But it was never completely broken. So, for example, religions maintained it. The Islamic movement has maintained it. So there's always been a connection to Africa, but in general, it was the development of the anti-colonial struggle after 1945 in particular, of the Du Bois's Pan-African Congresses, which of course was also there with the Garvey movement. So that reconnection suddenly then put African Americans in the context of world history. And we have to remember things like Du Bois's dissertation, doctoral dissertation, was on the slave trade. So he was investigating the connection and the way in which the profits from the slave trade really fueled the development of capitalism in this country. But so this anti-colonial struggle, particularly as it developed into armed struggle following the great advance represented by Kwame Nkrumah, this then created a great opportunity to think about the liberation of Black people in this country, since there were so many comparisons to the colonial experience, and particularly in places like South Africa and apartheid. which was, similar to the segregation. It was called segregation here. It was called apartheid in South Africa. So we started out calling it Black Studies, which was a way of saying the polar opposite to white racism was Black Studies. And it was taking Black as an affirmative since it had been a negative. So we had taken it and made it a positive. So, the song, I'm Black and I'm Proud, et cetera. So that was the beginning. But this increased connection to Africa and the struggle then has led to Africana studies. But part of what was driving that is a new pattern of immigration from Africa. So that what we have now in the naming of programs on the West Coast, you get more of a tendency toward ethnic studies because of the Latinx and Asian comparable struggles on college campuses and in the community. So there was more of a rainbow connection there. Whereas on the East Coast, you've got immigration from Africa and the Caribbean. So the Africana studies was more powerful on the East Coast. But it's interesting because Northwestern University, for example, they had a department. They just renamed the department back to Black Studies. So there's this constant struggle to clarify. So Black Studies, African American Studies, Afro-American Studies, Africana Studies, all of these things really point to this great struggle around identity, which is really no different than the whole idea of what it means to be an American in relationship to all the diasporas, all the ethnicities that exist. I mean, I grew up in Chicago. St. Patrick's Day in Chicago, they dye the river green. I mean, in other words, there's this ethnic identity thing is a serious matter. And of course, there are many cities now that are full of recent migrants, so that some cities have a large Somali population. Washington, D.C. has a large Ethiopian population. Many places have a large Mexican population. So this is just part of the American drama that we're all living through. And it's really a wonderful part of the country. I mean, it's part of the struggle of democracy is to embrace that. Now,
Yeah.
What was the second part of your question?
The second part of my question, I mean, I think you addressed it by clarifying Africana and Black studies and its regional variants. So that was great. And then I wanted to build off of that. When you're talking about these geographic names is about clarifying things, right? And so the next two questions I have are about clarifying one, the state of Black studies, and then Afro-Latino studies, Afro-Latinx studies. So this question, this was going to be kind of built based off your slides, which we haven't gotten to, I'm sorry. But you also mentioned this in your book. But in your slides and in the history of Black studies, you show important Black studies journals, the Black scholars among them. You detail that our popular periodizing of the 60s as the civil rights movement is a liberal reduction of the Black liberation movement. Here, I think also about contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter and how Black Panther vet Dhruba bin Wahad saying that our current movement should have been named Black Liberation Movement rather than Black Lives Matter, as that would have focused us differently. This is a long buildup to say that one of the important issues that you reference in the history of Black studies of the Black scholar is which is accessible for free online if you have like student credentials via JSTOR, is volume 44, number 2 from summer 2014 called The States of Black Studies. And I was reading Dylan Rodriguez' Black Studies at an Impasse and Christina Sharp's Black Studies in the Wake, Joy James' Afro-Realism and the Black Matrix, Maroon Philosophy at Democracy's Border, and finally Denise Ferreira da Silva's Toward a Black Feminist Poetics, The Quest of Blackness Toward the End of the World. Within Black studies, there seems to be so many contentious desires, sometimes for the end of this world as currently structured. You even talk about knowledge for the sake of social transformation. And I'm seeing that across Black studies. And yet I also think about, recently Colin Kaepernick had this book come out. I think they just edited it, but it was called Our History Has Always Been Contraband, right? And so I am wondering if you can talk about the state of Black studies today in relation to the anti-Black educational system that we're always already in, that kind of uh, makes it seem as if Black people don't come from traditions of thought of our own, right? Um, and can you speak to our freedom, our liberation, our Black study as extensions of freedom movement, as also contraband, and how you have experienced this in your life as a scholar activist and former chair of SNCC?
Well, I love talking with you because you give so many questions, and it makes me think about so many different things. Let me start by saying I think that there are two aspects of Black studies that really are pushing us forward into the future. The first is this whole question of the African diaspora. What's interesting is that we in this country often study Africa, but Africa does not often study us. And so that's a very important development that has to happen. But even more fundamental is that African studies is just really beginning in many African countries. In other words, this is a post-colonial possibility that is developing. And even more than just Africa, African peoples throughout Europe and the Caribbean are just now beginning, England has had a longer history than many countries. But for example, in France, they don't even collect statistics, population statistics that would get at the Black experience in France. The argument there is that if they did that, it would create more problems than it would solve. But that just means that there's no knowledge about, this problem. As we know, there, is a need to understand. In other words, you can't have a prognosis unless you have a diagnosis. So that's one important aspect. And the second aspect of the future, of course, is the technology. Now, of course, we had a little bump in the road on Zoom today, but Zoom is the new normal. I mean, we're all going to get past these little bumps in the road, but this is something we're going to be using. For that matter, I just really checked out this week Chat GPT. That's the new normal. I mean, if I was a student, I would be using it. And so on the faculty level, you know what I mean? What are we going to do? In other words, education has changed. Okay, so those are the two things, the technology aspect, and they connect because with the new technology, we are global. So that it's possible for us now. See, it used to be that it was important to go someplace, and so it was a big deal. Have you been to Africa? Have you been to the Caribbean? The reality now is we can all be everywhere virtually. And this is really important. And so I really urge you to make a connection with campuses in other parts of the world and make that a possibility because after all, English, for good or for bad, has become the new global lingua franca. In other words, people speak English more than any other language to communicate globally.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. We can transfer into your slides now. I think that the screen sharing is now working. If that sounds good to you, I have two other questions I could also ask if you would like to spend more time.
Yeah, whatever you want to do.
Audience, what do y'all want?
Right.
Let's see a slide.
Let's see a slide.
Gallery. Can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Now, the question of time, do we have the time for me just to go through them, or shall I give a shortened version of them?
On my
Yeah.
end, I'll be here till you want to leave.
Yes, please go through them.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you. As an activist in Black studies for many decades, I'm asking this important question. Why is the history of Black studies so important? As you can see from this slide, I've written 2 recent books, and in fact have studied our field of study for many years since we began in the late 1960s. Let's start with this. When Black people create something sustainable, like Black studies, it makes sense to us. It's a response to the life people have been living. Our action has always been a response. The question is, what are we responding to? That's the answer to this question. Indeed, Black studies is a solution. So we have to ask this question, what is the problem? Okay, you probably knew the answer, but today everybody doesn't really know how deep this racism problem has been and is. Otherwise, there would be no controversy over the concept that Black lives matter. One of the profound impacts of racism is to argue that Black people lack reason, the ability to know the world as it actually is, and then base actions on this kind of understanding. Others have to think for Black people, as they can't really do it for themselves. In any case, the Black experience is just not that important. That's a racist point of view. This is the justification for limiting, if not outlawing, educational opportunities, because racism would argue that this would be a waste. Just to mention one important example of the hypocrisy of this. In 1944, the Carnegie Foundation wanted to sponsor a large-scale study of Black people and the possibility of democracy. They didn't assume that Black people should be called upon to do such a study, fearing bias. So they didn't reach out to Black people. Instead, they called upon a Swedish economist, Gunnar Myrdal, to produce the 1,500-page study, An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, on the assumption that a European scholar would not be guided by any bias. Of course, what Myrdal did was to commission studies by important US scholars, and that included many Black academics, such as Sterling Brown, Allison Davis, St. Clair Drake, E. Franklin Frazier, Charles Johnson, and Ralph Bunche. Now, Ralph Bunche, with a Harvard PhD, served as a professor and founding head of the political science department at Howard University from 1928 to 1941. He wrote 4 long manuscripts for Myrdal, book-length manuscripts. A brief and tentative analysis of Negro leadership, for example, or the political status of the Negro, for example. So on the front end, they ignored Black scholarship, but on the back end, they relied upon it. So Black studies has always been with us for at least the last 150 years in one form or another. So here are the outline of my remarks. After discussing a definition of Black studies, I will reflect on the 3 main manifestations of it in intellectual history, in social movements, and as an academic profession. Finally, I will comment on the future of Black studies. This covers my 2 books, The History of Black Studies and The Future of Black Studies. And finally, a few words about my role as a scholar activist. First, the definition. Black studies includes those activities, 1, that study and teach about African Americans, including Africans and other African descendant people. 2, where Black people themselves are the main agents or protagonists of the study and learning. And 3, that counter racism and contribute to human liberation. And 4, that celebrate the Black experience. And 5, Black studies presents an analysis of the economies, cultures, and politics of the American hemisphere and Western Europe, and the perspective of people of African descent. Now, this comprehensive definition is really a description of what people are doing, maybe not on every campus, but it does cover the field in general. Now on to intellectual history. And there's no better place to make this point than with Dr. Du Bois. Du Bois succeeded in mainstream academic work at Berlin and Harvard, of course, first at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, demonstrating that Black scholars were worthy of the highest standards of Western scholarship. Relevant today, Du Bois set a high standard with his research and interpretation of the Black experience. He did history, especially on the slave trade and the Reconstruction. He did sociology, especially on social class and the urban experience. He did literature, especially with his novels and poetry. He organized others to do Black studies, especially his journal work and his Atlanta conferences. He performed as a public intellectual, especially his Pan-African activism and his role in the NAACP and editing of Crisis magazine. And he cared for the children with his monthly Brownies book. His work remains fundamental and foundational for us today. But there's so many more, and all of it has been remembered by the bibliographers. Now, here in this slide, I've demonstrated that for over 100 years, Black scholarship has been recorded in bibliographies, mainly carried out by African American scholars and librarians. Now, across the top, you can see the decades to enable us to see what bibliographies covered in those years. These lists contain a treasure trove of research that has covered all of the main issues of the Black experience. Any important issue being discussed today, you'll find has been discussed in this literature. New data, yes, new perspectives, yes, but every important question is not new. Check it out. Up until the 1960s, most of this work was done at an HBCU like Howard or Fisk or Atlanta University. Now, this slide shows a profile of scholars on the Howard faculty who demonstrate the critical importance of an HBCU, that stands for Historically Black College and University, HBCU, faculty for research on the Black experience. Now, they got their degrees, as you can see, from the major universities in this country, the most elite universities, Harvard, Columbia, Chicago, NYU, Brown, etc. But they couldn't work there. But they were productive. They were the center of scholarship on the Black experience. But we must remember that the HBCU institutions were created within the same framework, that is, their founding was in the same framework as the mainstream, and therefore was decidedly Eurocentric. For example, here is what the Fisk University curriculum required. The foundation, as you can see, Greece and Rome. And Howard University in Washington, D.C., by 1900, Howard University required of graduates 4 years of Latin and 2 years of Greek. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, because knowing Latin and Greek gives you a foundation in understanding Western thinking. But to limit it to that puts you in a box that you need to be out of. So the fight against limiting our curriculum to Eurocentrism actually began in the HBCUs. Now, the common thinking is that African studies began at Northwestern University under the anthropologist Melville Herskovits in 1948. That's simply not the case. African studies began at Fisk University in Nashville in 1943 under the linguist Mark Hanna Watkins, before he joined the Howard faculty from 1947 to 1972. But Black studies as intellectual history came out of the community as much as it did institutions of higher education. You can see the listing of courses that were taught at Fisk in 1943. But now we're going to go from the HBCUs to the community. Now, bookstores were a great resource for the community, enabling the distribution of publications about the Black experience, especially the publications being created out of their own community. In this slide, you can see the National Memorial African Bookstore that was once the main bookstore in Harlem, New York. Brother Michaud ran the store. You can see him in the upper right-hand corner of that slide. And below, in the lower right, you see one of his main customers, Malcolm X. Now, publication by and about Black people were an important political and cultural lifeline for Black people. They fed the freedom movement with the intellectual production of Black people who were frozen out of the mainstream. You know, freedom of the press required you to own a press. This kind of community-based production of knowledge revealed a tradition of ideological frameworks for Black intellectual thinking. There are 5 main ideological frameworks that map Black intellectual history: Pan-Africanism, nationalism, liberation theology, feminism, and socialism. Now, they're distinct on an analytical level, but in actual practice, people link multiple frameworks in the various stages that their lives pass through. Now, can I assume that most of you all know who these people are? Malcolm, King,
Yeah, there's Ida B.
Garvey.
Wells and Al Baker and Malcolm and Martin and Du Bois and Garvey.
There you go. These ideological frameworks become clear in the next major way that Black studies has been performed within social movements. Now, my summation is that there have been 6 major kinds of social movements, and workers have been the foundation of each of these movements. Maybe something new is happening now. I'll leave that to you younger scholars to figure that out. The freedom movement, the Black power movement, the Black arts movement, the new communist movement, the Black women's movement, and the Black student movement. Now, my argument is that an action-oriented Black studies curriculum was developed in each of these social movements on 2 levels. One, for cadre development, that is for the main activists in the movement, and 2, for the broader community, to establish the legitimacy of the movement among the broad masses of people. I'll just mention a few examples. At the heart of the freedom movement, often renamed as the civil rights movement, were freedom schools set up to counter the miseducation being forced on Black children and adults as well. Black history and Black literature were always in the curriculum of the freedom schools, but almost never in the public schools of the South. The curriculum of the SNCC-run freedom schools dealt with questions that helped build the movement and the community. These were some of the questions that the curriculum of the SNCC-run freedom schools dealt with. Why are we, students and teachers, in freedom schools? What is the freedom movement? What alternatives does the freedom movement offer us? What does the majority culture have that we want? What does the majority culture have that we don't want? What do we have that we want to keep? The civil rights movement, the name given to the freedom movement, was transformed by the emergence of Black power. Now, Malcolm X Liberation University is an example of the education, what I'm calling emergent institutions, were set up by the activists of the Black Power movement. The founder shown here in this slide is Howard Fuller, also known as Owusu Sodoki, with Dwight Hopkins sitting at this table, who was president of the African American Student Society at Duke University. The student struggle at Duke, confronting institutional racism, led to the formation of Malcolm X Liberation University. Their orientation was to train students with the technical and cultural skills needed to work at the community grassroots level, not only in the local community of the United States, but in Africa and the African diaspora as well. As is obvious by their name, their inspiration and guidance came from Malcolm X. Another example is the East and their Uhuru Sasa Independent School. A whole national network of such schools was set up and organized as an alternative system of such institutions. In the case of the East, which was set up in Brooklyn, New York, its founder was J2 Weusi, also known as Leslie Campbell, a former public school teacher in New York. He fought the racist discrimination in New York public schools and decided to establish this independent set of organizations as moves for Black self-determination. Knowledge production and learning programs were a priority. Now note, he was active in promoting jazz, a fundamental foundation of the Black arts movement. Now, the Black arts movement not only performed and celebrated the Black experience, but institutions were established and journals were created to educate the public and to build a way for Black cultural activists to be educated and nurtured. Now, here in this slide, you see Barbara Ann Teer, founder of the National Black Theater and the important journal that collectivized Black theater activists. Building audience for the arts in the Black community was key. As a working class community, this also was connected to building a movement of Black workers. Left-wing resurgence for the entire country was led by militant Black workers in Detroit, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. One of the first things they did was establish a bookstore and a publishing program to educate the public about the economic exploitation they were experiencing. And students at Wayne State University in Detroit, who supported the League, seized the student newspaper and put out an issue for the League with the headline, "One class-conscious worker was worth 100 students." I'll let you all debate that question. Now, note on the left of this slide, they had newsletters in each of the factories that League workers were active in. In other words, they created really a curriculum for the study of workers in each of these plants. Now, on the right, the brother you see in that slide is the leader of the League called General Baker. And yes, that was his actual name. His parents named him General Baker. The movie that was made about the League, Finally Got the News, became a requirement in many Black studies programs. That was really a slogan that they were using when they were picketing a UAW, United Auto Workers Convention, where they said, "We finally got the news about how our dues are being used." And UAW means you ain't white. This is what the workers were chanting as they were challenging the union. So the silence of the Black working masses was finally broken. And this was extended to women. But of course, women were never silent. They've been providing key roles to all the social movements historically. Now, the journal here in the middle of this slide, Triple Jeopardy, Racism, Imperialism, and Sexism, was created by the Third World Women's Alliance. They came out of a women's caucus of SNCC, as represented in this slide in the upper left by Fran Beal. This is what Fran said, quote, "I was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You're talking about liberation and freedom half the night on the racial side, and then all of a sudden men were going to turn around and start talking about how putting you in your place." So in 1968, we founded the SNCC Black Women's Liberation Committee to take up some of these issues. Now, also on the right is Audre Lorde, the leader of the Black LGBTQ emergence as its own movement for liberation, but intimately connected to the movement by Black people, by women, by artists, and by workers. So Black Studies was born in the HBCUs, the Black community, and Black social movements. But it was in the 60s that it was forced its way into mainstream educational institutions. In general, the process of Black studies became an academic profession involving 6 aspects: social disruption, militant action that forced change. In other words, it wasn't just an intellectual idea, it was social protest that created Black studies in the mainstream. Building consensus, building a language, a common language and conceptual framework. Building institutions, creating organizations, centers, institutes, committees, programs, departments. Establishing the profession, creating PhD degree programs, journals, tenure-track faculty positions, professional organization, all based on peer review, which really is a form of self-governance. Theorizing, theories that maintain conceptual framework, and norming research, common methodological practices, and empirical data foci. These are general stages, and each institution has its own particular path and timing. So we need a history of each institution, as Black Studies is one of the main accomplishments of the Black Power movement. I mean, there are almost 400 real programs that exist, and we need to understand how that took place, how a social movement transformed higher education. Now, the Black Power movement erupted into mainstream institutions of higher education. Black students forced a crisis that created Black studies. Black Power and the assassination of Martin Luther King led to a great enrollment of Black students into institutions of higher education. Now, here on the left is an incident at San Francisco State, and on the right at Cornell University, all in the pivotal years of 1968 and 1969. First-generation college students, inspired by the Black Power movement, entered colleges, faced institutional racism, and then disrupted by seizing buildings and forcing change. This included Howard University. Now, Black Studies has developed legitimacy in the eyes of students over the last decade. You can see the enrollment pattern reaching as high as 1,000 degrees in a given year. They used to put out a statement every year about how Black Studies was ending, but it's clear that it's not. It's a permanent part of higher education. This is data from the National Center for Education Statistics. Now, several professional organizations representing Black studies, in this case, ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded by Carter G. Woodson, his picture there, and the National Council for Black Studies, founded in 1975. ASALH was founded in 1915. And of course, another major organization of note, especially in terms of digital representation of scholarship, is the African American Intellectual History Society. That was formed in 2014. These professional organizations are where one meets peers and builds networks of Black studies professionals, faculty, and students. And their journals. This is the professional literature of peer-reviewed scholarship. This is a major evaluation mechanism for Black studies professionals, how research productivity is approved by professional colleagues in Black studies. Journals represent really the life stream of knowledge creation. Now, the first research expectation for a Black studies academic professional is the PhD degree. And of course, there are some variations here. For example, if you're in art, the MFA, there are other degrees. In law, there's a law degree, et cetera. But the PhD degree is a great expectation. Now, many move into Black studies after a dissertation on the Black experience from some other discipline. But there are, in fact, PhD programs in Black studies. Now, in this slide, I've categorized 3 types of PhD degree options in Black studies. A full independent department able to grant their own degrees, a partnership, legitimacy based on collaboration of a Black studies program with an existing department, or a certificate that a department would offer, for example, a history department or a sociology department, or a Black studies program can offer a certificate, not a full degree. And in all of this, theory is important. Now, there are many approaches to describing Black studies theory. At one point, at the origin of Black studies, we often thought of it in terms of the ideological polarity of Marxism versus nationalism. These ideological guides to practice are still in play, but they're not the main way to think about Black studies theory in my point of view. I tend to think the main contrast is about where one begins, a priority of departure for the evaluation or summation of historical experience. Afrocentrism seeks understanding and clarity from origins, sometimes in ancient Africa and sometimes in traditional Africa. The argument is that there is an autonomy to a historical heritage, a continuity of identity and culture that links African peoples from then until now. Alternatively, a Black experientialism, theoretical orientation begins with some immediate African American experience at any point in time, and then understands that experience in terms of future or past experience. Now, these people are good examples of people who take these alternative positions. On the Afrocentrist side, there is Karinga, Asante, Ama Mazama, and Linda James Myers. On the Black experientialist side, there's Gerald Horne, Henry Louis Gates, Michelle Alexander, and Barbara Ransby. And we can explore more of this in the discussion, which of course we've already had, but we can have some more. Now, my approach is to search for a way to unify the empirical and theoretical work in the field, not by proposing a synthesis or a common agreement, but by proposing a way to understand and work with differences. In other words, everybody in Black studies needs to be heard, but we need a framework in order to understand and compare. In this framework, I'm calling a paradigm of unity. It is possible to locate aspects of the Black experience in historical context. In these Cartesian spaces, we can then share alternatives, including data, concepts, theories, toward a dialogue that can be inclusive of the field. In other words, you go to any one of those boxes, for example, emancipation, and class. And the question is, what do different people have to say about that? The point is not to choose between different orientations, but of course, we'll all have our own individual choices. But as a discipline, as a collective activity that involves all of us, the goal is to understand the intellectual productivity of the discipline without trying to silence people. In this atmosphere, we need to take the negative energy, the struggle between different points of view, and use it to leap forward faster. So now I'm going to make a couple of points about the future of Black studies. Start by thinking about the future. We have to be mindful that the battle of ideas is constant. And we have two ways to think about the Black Panthers: fantasy or make-believe, or what actually happened. One works with the CIA, and the other was hunted down and murdered by the CIA. When I first visited the store at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, there was more stuff for sale about Wakanda than the actual Africa that exists. Now, certainly Black people have always imagined ways to think about the future, but the bottom line has always been, what are we going to do to create the future that we want? What is actually possible? That's what we face in the history of Black studies, what is actually possible. And I suggest there are two ways the future of Black studies is being created. While the African diaspora is a concept at the abstract analytical level, we have not had a good history of research and representation in each country throughout the African diaspora. Colonialism has been a silencing project, but now there has begun a new period of awakening. This slide, you see a sister on the right, Zulu, on the left, two sisters from Philadelphia. The diversity of Africa is being studied more and more. In Western and even Asia, research on the Black experience is taking off. The exciting future is when these empirical studies and all the wonderful diversity to be found there get synthesized and historicized into coherent theory. Really, Black studies within world history. A second future is what I am calling e-Black studies. You know about e-commerce. This is e-Black studies, a transformation based on digital technology. This slide represents the work I did while at the University of Toledo in Ohio. We took 5 aspects of academic practice and demonstrated how the use of digital technology would be transformative: professional discourse, curriculum development, research productivity, public policy, community service. And then the 3 columns: Black studies, and e-Black studies, and then what we did at Toledo. Professional discourse from face-to-face to virtual interaction. Curriculum development from face-to-face to distance learning, now using webinar sessions. Research productivity moving from hard copy forms to virtual websites. Moving public policy interventions and community service into the virtual realm. But further, we're also concerned with method. What we have been using is something we call the D7 method. Definition: what is the research question? Data: what material is being studied? Digitization: putting that data into cyberspace. Discovery: what are the findings? What of your analysis? Design: how are you preparing your findings, your report, for what audience? Distribution: how are you going to spread the word? And finally, D7, difference: so what? Now, 5 of these 7 are what we would normally do. But there are 2 new features: digitization and design. This also embraces the mission slogan we developed for Black Studies: academic excellence and social responsibility. D7 difference is about social responsibility. Okay, that's the general discussion that I have, but I also want to sort of introduce myself. These 2 images speak to my background: degree from the University of Chicago and my participation in SNCC. These are the contexts in which I search for academic excellence and social responsibility. A good example of my experience is work on African liberation. I served on the executive committee of the African Liberation Support Committee. Our great forum in 1974, held at Howard University on video, is now hosted on the Howard website. On the academic side of this slideshow, a lecture I gave at the University of Chicago about the connection of Chicago to African liberation. That's what this slide shows. And in terms of research, I wrote a book on the historical experience of ALSC: Theory and Practice, Academic Excellence, and Social Responsibility. Now, currently, I'm on the Education Committee of the Southern Workers Assembly. The SWA is building workplace committees and is being supported by the long-standing organization Black Workers for Justice. This slide is about a presentation I made at a workers' school in Charlottesville, North Carolina, to about 150 workers, Black and white, from 10 Southern states. Black Studies is a collective think tank for Black people. We're not just individuals in good jobs with tenured, permanent jobs. We're here to serve our people, and for that, we need to be held accountable. I've tried to tell our story and confess my practice as a model for students. Much more needs to be said, but I look forward to any further questions you have and comments. Thank you very much. That's me many years ago. But I tell you one thing to students: the way you look now may not be the way you're going to look later on.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. I have myself one last question to connect this to Minneapolis College, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Some context of our institution is this is a 2-year commuter school, Minneapolis Community Technical College. We have, I'm a major in the African Diaspora Studies program, which is kind of new here. Yeah. But what I've been told from different deans is it's kind of a literary program-ish. It doesn't have cohesion with history department or other things. And so I'm curious, like when you're talking about social responsibility, our school, this school is 35% Black students. And so, but students ask me, well, what even is the value of Black study? What can I do with a degree like this? What kind of things would Black students need to do to get a department or something at a 2-year kind of school in Black studies?
Yeah, I think there are always 2 directions to go. The first direction to go is to the community, because that's where ultimately power exists. And so the question of how to be effective in the community, this could begin with libraries. There's usually one library that connects with the Black community. There are Black organizations, and certainly their needs, you know. So that's the first thing, is a connection to the community. The second thing is, and then that, of course, then represents a voice of support for any development of Black studies on the campus. Then the question on campus, there are 2 aspects to it. One is a Black studies program and the integrity of that program. And the other aspect is a transformation of the institution as a whole. So that, for example, the demand for Black students the demand for Black faculty, the demand for Black administrators. So that inclusion demand is very important. But also the question of the curriculum being connected to the desires of the Black people who are on that campus, but also the national norms. So that, for example, I would say that the community college, national community, should be part of where you should look to create national norms. And there are community colleges in virtually every major city, particularly where there's a Black population, and whether it's Oakland or Chicago or Detroit or so that's very important because administrators are held accountable to national norms. That's very important. See, it was different in the day when you were creating something totally new, but now there's a lot of models to use. And I think that, but on the question of why study it, what can I do with it? There are two answers to that question too. One answer is, what can you do with anything? What can you do when you major in English, or history? I mean, one obvious answer is, well, eventually you can teach it. But it's not a vocational skill that most majors reflect. So that's the first point. You have to really make the argument that psychology, what are you going to do with that? And if somebody says social work, then obviously learning about the Black community is a great asset if you're going to go into social work. So, okay. But the other aspect of the thing is, what does it mean to have a democratic society if we don't have people who are understanding of the problems that have to be overcome in order to have a democratic society? And everybody needs to start with who they are. So there's no confusion about the fact that women's studies is mostly taken by women. In other words, every issue in the society, sexism and patriarchy, is a big problem in this society. And therefore, we need women's studies in order to deal with that. In other words, democracy depends upon our having this kind of diversity of educational opportunities. That's why the right wing in Florida and Texas is so aggressive about making sure you can't teach any Black history that make white people feel uncomfortable. What? The past is what we're trying to overcome. And if you feel uncomfortable about the past, maybe that's what you ought to feel, because the future should not make you feel uncomfortable if you do what's right. But if you ignore the past, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be repeated. So I think those are some of my comments to your very important question.
Thank you so much for your responses. Now we can open it up to the rest of the audience. I know so you can ask one first, and then everybody else can ask after Marcus.
My name is Marcus. I'm a student here at MCTC, and I had a question for you. Very first day I saw your flyer, letting us know that you were coming here, and just off the top of my head, I didn't know you. I didn't really think. I just saw your name, and I wanted to know why. Were you born with the name that I'm looking at? Abdul.
Okay.
He's already talking.
Well, my answer to that is yes, I was born with it in my heart. That's what I became. A servant of knowledge, the son of word. And I was given the name McWhorter, which is a freedom name. And it's so strong. My great-great-grandfather purchased 16 family members out of slavery. And New Philadelphia, the town that he set up, in December of 22 was made a national park. In other words, here's what happened in Illinois. 2 national historic sites were set up. One was about Emmett Till, about a murder. New Philadelphia is a freedom story. Underground Railroad came through there, and we grew up with the story. If you could get to New Philadelphia, you get a pair of shoes, a horse, and one of those McWhorter boys would help guide you north. I grew up with that. And what happened is the archaeologists did digs and they discovered there were 2 cobblers in New Philadelphia making shoes for this tiny little town. You know, so yeah, I got that name that sounds like it's from somewhere else, but it was in me all along.
Okay, I want to know if your name is Arabic, and if it is an Arabic name, would you may have, or did you consider a West African name?
Actually, what happened is, as I said before, I'm sitting next to Kofi Wangara. He helped me get the name. And when we were doing it, the Liberation Committee of the Organization of African Unity was based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And so we were oriented toward Tanzania and the Liberation Committee. And the Kofi had taught himself Kiswahili and Arabic. And so it's out of that context that I took the name. And of course, we know that African Americans in their identity with Africa have chosen different parts of Africa for different reasons. Now, in my particular case, I have a strong connection to Ghana. In fact, I am a fellow at Commonwealth Hall at the University of Ghana in Legon. So, and of course, Nkrumah made that connection. But also, you know, there's Nigeria. There's you know, increasingly South Africa. You know, we don't have as much the French, the Portuguese, et cetera. That's partly a language question, partly it's an international sphere of influence question. But you're right that when African Americans go to Africa, it's normally to West Africa, and the connection to the slave trade and trying to rediscover family connections. And in my own context, my African ancestor is definitely from West Africa. So I take your point.
Thank you for that. Would anybody else like to ask any questions?
Hello. I would actually want to know, how do you know that your ancestors are from West Africa? And also, I would like to know your belief or your opinion on the Hebrew Israelite belief, or that some people believe that some of us were indigenous to America. What do you think about those?
Well, first of all, the knowledge about our family ancestor comes from my cousin, who did her dissertation research at the University of Chicago under John Hope Franklin, and published the book Free Frank. So that's an important reference for that. The second thing about some of us are indigenous to the United States. Look, the interesting thing about Black people is we're indigenous to everywhere. See, let me start by saying that our species, human beings, originated in Africa. So we're all Africans from that standpoint. Just depends on how far back you go. Secondly, wherever Black people went, they connected with whoever was there. So we got all kind of Black people connected to the Native Americans. We got all kind of Black people connected to, and if you take Van Sertima's research, then you would get into the possibility of pre-Columbian African exploration of the New World. So, you know, look, the Chinese are not the only people everywhere. Black people everywhere too. We just don't have African restaurants everywhere.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, one of the questions I have for you was about Ivan Van Sertima's. They came before Columbus, so I'm glad that it came up here as well. Would anybody else like to ask any other questions? If nobody's got another first question, we can have Marcus for this question, then I can end us with the closing, unless Charles would like to say something.
The importance of Black studies. Let's just imagine that every inner city in America, in the West Indies, every hood, and all of the younger people who are in the urban culture, what if they all became familiar with or learned Black studies?
Mm.
What is the benefit of a possible change for the better?
Mm. See, you have to ask the question, have ignorant people ever gotten free? I think the answer is probably no. Ignorance does not lead to having not only a vision of the future, but an understanding of how to get there. Now, Black Studies gives you an example, all the examples of history. And one of the interesting things is, you know, people often say that things failed. This movement failed, that movement failed. See, I take a different position. And my position is that you fight, you learn. You fight, you learn. And all those learnings eventually can lead to a strategy of success. So all those people you just mentioned, if they knew the history of their community, if they knew the history of Black struggle, if they knew the history of Black thought, they'd be able to figure out this mess we're in. Because right now, if you listen to people, like, for example, take most of the hip hop, do you think everybody understands the reality of America? Waving money, talking about the sisters and the honeys and this and that and this. It's ignorance. What we need is enlightenment, intelligence. And that's what the system doesn't want. See, what you just said is what they don't want. Why is DeSantis the main obstacle to what you just said? Because what you just said would lead to a movement way beyond any movement we've ever had for freedom. Now, of course, we got to figure out what the hell the word freedom means. That's not easy. You know, now my way of freedom right now has something to do with universal health care. Because if you're sick and you can't get to a doctor, how can you use the word free? I also think literacy. In the 60s, our literacy was going up. Now it's reversed. I mean, if our people are not literate, Just like, you know, when we were reading newspapers, what section of the newspapers were we reading? Sports, entertainment, maybe the front page. We weren't reading the business section and figuring out the mess that we're in and how we're being exploited. So yeah, I mean, I'm for Black studies, you know.
I'd like to jump in for a second. We're, a solid 30 minutes beyond our closing time, but boy, it's been worth every minute. Professor Alkalimat, thank you is an inadequate, insufficient way to express the gratitude I have, and I dare say I'll speak for the group that we have for what you brought to us this evening, and your generosity in allowing us to record your remarks, forward your slides, so that we can keep the teach-in going. Because you started the teach-in for us, and we're going to do our best to keep it going. I really appreciate you. I hope that this affords us the opportunity to stay in touch moving forward.
Yeah.
And we got to figure out a way, now that we've got this relationship going, to bring you back next year. Because, it's always a challenge getting the contract moving, but we want to bring you back next year to have this kind of presentation as a centerpiece of our Black History Month programming. So this is really what it was supposed to be, y'all, on the call. We just got to it a little later, but like I said on February 1, if Black history is 365 days a year, then it's real good in March, April, May, and June. So, sir, thank you so much. And we're going to let the final word come from our moderator, the interlocutor for the hour, the president of our Black Student Union. Matthew Anthony's going to close us out with a closing thought and remark. Thank you.
So sorry that I forgot I was on camera. We were talking about if we could put this on YouTube. So yeah, well, we're very interested in the things you're saying and figuring out how to disseminate it. Again, just really want to thank you for taking time out of your Wednesday night. I know it's been a couple of reschedules for making this happen and everything, but for me, speaking for myself, this is life-changing knowledge, like just being able to sit down and talk with an elder like you who's got the lived experience that you do. I'm really inspired by Joshua Myers of Black Study when he's quoting June Jordan, and she's talking about her essay, Bringing Back the Person. She says, we're looking for teachers least likely to lie to us. And so that's the reason why I reached out to you, and I appreciate you for not lying to us.
Well, thank you very much. One of the things that is at the heart of what we concern ourselves with as elders is having a way to pass it along. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to share. That's what I want to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Charles, is there like a debriefing after, or are we just calling a cut, or like what's the plan now? You're muted. I can't hear you.
Certainly for those that are there at the virtual watch party, y'all feel free to keep it going as you see fit. Seems like folk are starting to drop off the call, including the professor himself. So what I'll say to those that are still gathered on the Zoom, thank you for staying with us till the end. And I hope that you all feel that it was worth the time. Certainly that's how I'm feeling, and Matthew spoke to that. And I would just invite you to continue watching for upcoming programming coming out of the AME space and coming from the BSU. So I pray that you all have a blessed evening, and we'll see you next time.